Good morning and welcome to the Learning Ideas Conference 2021. And it's our 14th annual conference and our first under the new name and focus. I'm David Groundlick, the conference chair, and I'll be with you throughout the conference. So it's great to see everybody online and virtually. So thanks again for being here. So really looking forward to this year's conference. I miss seeing friends and colleagues, both old and new, in person once again this year, but I'm very much looking forward to our online conference and glad we have an audience from around the world who's able to join us. So it's really going to be a full 5 days. We have a full program with 100 talks or so total, 5 keynotes, Friday panel discussion, demos, interviews, so many more things. So really just a lot to look forward to. So I'll talk a little bit first about the conference and just to give you a little bit of little bit of the logistical side. As we go, please feel free to tweet about the conference using the hashtag #LearningIdeasConf. And as you have questions or comments for our speakers, please post them in the Zoom Q&A section. Zoom has both Q&A and chat, just to keep us on our toes. And our team will monitor those and try to get them in as many as possible. Also, please use the chat as much as you'd like to chat with each other and us and everybody else. So we're looking forward to an interactive event through the Zoom system. Our conference team will also be on Twitter, as you've seen, as with the handle Learning Ideas Co. So look for tweets there and tag us and all that kind of stuff. First, I want to talk for a little bit before we move on to the keynote, just about the conference and the motivation behind it. A lot of jobs these days are becoming automated. Everything from data entry to vacuuming, everything in between. Employees in almost any organization, in almost any role now, need to be able to synthesize information, make decisions, think critically, make judgments. And so we need education that prepares people for that. There's still a prevalent myth out there that education is about quote unquote content and information. You stuff people's heads with what they need to know. And to me, that's how you educate a machine. That's, we want Google to be able to find information. We want our databases to have information, but that's not really education for a person. People need to be engaged, and I mean that in the real true sense of that, not the superficial sense of the word. Relatable, interesting experiences, challenges, support, emotional connection, and more. So all of that is the way that I see education having the opportunity to change, both in the workplace and in higher education. Now, there are teachers out there who can do this. There are teachers who can, take a class, usually a relatively small class, and create just a wonderful, wonderful learning experience with students. But it's very, very difficult to do that on a large scale. And this is where technology can help. If we use it well, we come up with ideas, new experiences, and we can build things that scale up. So we build a great, AI-powered learning experience online or in a virtual world or with holograms or whatever we do, and things can scale up. There are a number of key themes that I think underlie the design approaches that we want to come up with as we look to reimagine educational experiences and take advantage of the opportunities that we have at what really is a critical time in society, in the world, and with some technological advantages that help us do things differently. And that's really what this conference, to me, at its base, is all about. One of the underlying themes is the use of technology in a humanizing way rather than a dehumanizing way. Technology often has a cold reputation, and deservedly so, and a lot in my opinion, very often, especially in the learning world. Learning management systems are not friendly. Today's online courses, the majority of them are not particularly friendly and emotionally connecting. There are some great ones out there, many of which are done by the people that are here at this conference. But if you walk into almost any company, you see a lot of things out there that are people don't find interesting or appealing, and that don't really help them learn to perform the job better. And you see some of that in universities too, where you see a lot of online courses that there's just a lot more that we can do. A lot of the uses of technology in current practice, focus on tracking learner progress rather than necessarily creating better experiences. And to me, a lot of what we want to do is focus on the experience. So That's why I think the humanizing factor really plays a big role. So to me, humanizing the use of technology doesn't necessarily just mean using technology to connect people, right? So I'm not talking about solely about social networking or video meetings, though those have excellent roles, as we are seeing today. But to learning experiences that are learner-driven on their own, but feel human. So you put in realistic situations, you have some kind of coaching component, you make decisions, you take actions, you're challenged, you have to think things through, you have a style of coaching guidance and feedback that's really appropriate for people and it's respectful. All of these things are things that we can do. They're not prevalent out there in the world today. Again, this is what this conference is all about. Next theme is respecting and fostering individuality. A lot of traditional education is done in lockstep. Everybody takes a class, does the same things, the same time, in the same way, or everyone takes a simple online course and they read the same content and watch the same videos and take the same test and get through it. With the help of artificial intelligence techniques, among other things, we have the opportunity to create experiences that are so much more individualized. And I think conceptually, we have the opportunity to use educational experiences, both in a higher education and the workplace, to encourage people to find their own paths, help them find their own paths, help them discover their strengths, work on their weaknesses, but discover their strengths, discover new interests. The entire conception of learning can change because we have the opportunity to take the best learning techniques that we've ever had and help them scale up. So really, to me, the goal of education at all levels is to help people be prepared for life, for work, to be an active, thoughtful member of society in ways that they feel comfortable. And we have so many things that we can do here that are different. Following in that vein, the next key theme to me is encouraging creativity and the freedom to fail and make mistakes. Feels like more than ever, certainly here in the US, in education, there's this emphasis and in workplaces on being correct. Get things right, get the right answer, don't risk making a fool of yourself. And that's a really, it's a very risk-averse philosophy, and doing things that way discourages creativity and experimentation, and I think tends to limit innovation and new ideas. And the real innovation in the true sense, not the buzzwordy sense of innovation. But again, there's an opportunity to do things differently and put people in a position where they become free to think, and that's where we're going to find advances, and probably argue that's where people we're going to find happiest and a happier society. So we're going to start this. We're going to start the conference with broad claims and broad aspirations, and I think those are really things that we want to move toward, and we can. So to me, it's time to reimagine the world of learning, and we've certainly taken some steps already, but that's really what this conference is about. The changes that we want, are interdisciplinary, they're international, they involve research and academic studies, they involve wild experimentation, new technology, user experience design, writing and scripting videos, memorable characters, a research-based foundation. Sometimes redesign focuses on hard science, sometimes messy creativity, sometimes both. And we're going to talk about all of this and more over the course of the week, and starting with our opening keynote. And so that leads me to Alicia Sanchez, who I'm just delighted to have as our opening keynote speaker. And she has a number of accomplishments. She's currently the Director of Innovation for the Department of Defense's Defense Acquisition University. She was previously their game czar. She's deployed over 80 games and simulations into the DIU curriculum. She's dedicated to the modernization of learning through the application of learning science, user-centered design, and her pet studies in cognitive biases and memory. So she brings together the research side and the application side, and again, the sort of the creativity involved in creating realistic, challenging, fascinating, interesting games that are not artificial, but they really are games and simulations built around something that you really need to do. And that's really the secret there. And she is a leading world expert on serious games and simulations for learning. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alicia. She's going to talk about learning on the seam, the intersection between learning science and user-centered design. So please welcome her as best you can. We can't hear the applause and all those things, but we will do that as well as we can. So I will stop my sharing, turn it over, and I'm really looking forward to this talk.
Well, thank you, David. That was a rousing welcome. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate being here. And all of you guys who have either gotten up earlier, it's the middle of your afternoon, as some of us were saying in chat, and wherever you are and however you've arrived here, thank you for having arrived here. Uh, David's put on this conference a few years ago. It's so exciting to see it under sort of a new title and to reinvigorate it, because I think we are looking at a really different future. And so I'm super excited to talk to you guys today about designing for the future, as David mentioned, and learning on the scene. So of course, as I arrived at this talk, and I promise you that creating one of these talks in this derangedly disconnected but hyper-connected, environment that we have because of the COVID pandemic, it was a bit of a learning experience for me. I consider myself certainly to be a learning scientist, and I always have. I've been at Defense Acquisition University for about 15 years, and I was originally the game czar. So as we think about learning on the scene and what this intersection between learning science and user-centered design is, I want to provide you guys, of course, with a good learning experience today. And I know that some of the concepts we're going to discuss aren't incredibly obvious, but I kind of want to weave the path of how I arrived here and what my thought process was, in hopes that perhaps it will resonate with some of you and create an opportunity to think about things just a little bit differently than we have. So let's get started. A little bit about me and my current challenges. For 14 years, I was the game czar, right? I was royalty. It was amazing. I was, and as David bragged a little bit, I was an internationally renowned serious games expert. I think at this point, we're up to about 100 games and simulations that we have implemented into DAU's curriculum that provide actual experiences. So we're not talking about Jeopardy games, not that they don't have a place, or Wheel of Fortune. We're really talking about experiential learning opportunities that augmented, supplemented, reinforced concepts within what can be an incredibly dry acquisition-based community. So I got to do this thing for 14 years, and about a year ago, just before the pandemic started, we had a little bit of a personnel reshuffle, which happens a lot. Defense Acquisition University, for those of you who don't know, is a DoD, Department of Defense in the US university. And so we teach people how to buy stuff, right? Not the most exciting stuff, but had a lot of opportunity to employ some finesse and some neat tactics. But of course, they decide to shuffle the deck on me after I've just gotten cozy. It took me 14 years to get cozy. And one of my colleagues is actually here today, a colleague and an extremely esteemed, not just confident, but someone who bounces ideas off. She'll be, I'm sure, active in the chat if you guys have questions, but I will leave questions for the end. But they shuffle the deck, and all of a sudden I'm the director of learning science. And as a learning scientist, that was a natural evolution for me. It's like, oh yeah, totally. I do all that learning science stuff. I totally get this. And all of a sudden I was in charge of how we design, produce, deliver, create assets and the learning that's behind them. And as someone who had really had the opportunity to focus on experiential learning from the learning science perspective, it was a little bit of a jolt. And then what happens? We have a pandemic. All of a sudden, we've got to retool and rework all of our courses in a matter of months. And what happens when it finally starts to calm down? They shuffle the deck again, right? So I am recently gleaned as the director of innovation out of our user experience directorate. And, I handle a team that we call DAUX. And it seemed like the next natural evolution, because what would I be doing except really considering how we can bring in new technologies, because we've got this entire new learning ecosystem and all of these opportunities have faced us. But it turns out I'm not that great at technology. Some of you are not surprised. I know some of you on the line. I'm good, but I'm not great, right? And so what really happened was that the innovation that we've started truly employing is based on how we actually position our learning. I've become a learning scientist in a way that I never was before. And I am now forced to think about things a little bit differently. And it's that frame that I want to express to you guys today, because I think it is just a small twist on how a lot of us see the world. And so I hope you will find value in my perspective, but that's sort of the backstory of how I have arrived here in front of you today. So as our new director of innovation, and as we all expected, thinking about technology, I started really thinking about what are these wonderful technological solutions that we've seen out there in the real world, right? What are examples of amazing design? What are examples of really great user experiences? So I took off my learning hat for a moment and I sort of trotted on over to the internet, as we do. And I used the Google machine and I started looking at what are great examples of design in our world to try to find some inspiration for how we think about learning. And I found lots of great stuff, right? There's no shortage of cool design, like that, what do they call that? The mirror, the workout thing. Brilliant. It's a mirror some of the time. The rest of the time, it's a workout thing. Workout rooms are filled with mirrors. Brilliant. We've seen good design, certainly from Apple, consistently for a very long time. When the cute little shuffle, or not the shuffle, the iPod first came out, it was a jolt, right? Like this wheel. What am I supposed to do with this wheel? I don't know what to do with this thing. And like that, like if you gave me an Android now, I would be lost. I actually have one, and because I have to have two, of course. And I can barely use this thing. The vacuum, like, oh my gosh, Dyson, that roller ball that makes it so much more navigable so you don't have to like drag it across. Brilliant. And then I started looking at what's happening in the online world. And of course, we're seeing brilliant design all over the place. These are a couple of examples from like the top 20 websites that you have to visit in 2021 because they've been designed from this incredibly beautiful perspective. So what is different about all of these examples that we see out there in the world? And of course, how we, as some of us are instructional designers, some of us are learning scientists, some of us are educators, what's the gap between seeing all of this beautiful stuff and what we see? I don't know how many of you guys remember Kids in the Hall, but they used to have a skit and it was a lowered expectations. It was a dating thing, hysterical. And that's what I always think about when I think about the educational experiences that we provide. We're going to talk a little bit about mandatory compliance training in a moment. I'll save that little gem for you. But what I did realize is that we haven't really done the service, or at least I haven't. And so again, this is how I arrived, about thinking about our learners as consumers. But of course they are. Of course they're consumers. They have choices. I happen to work in an area that has a very captive audience, like it's bordering on hostage situation. But in the future, we have to have the expectation that our students are going to have choices about where they go for their education, for their training. Most do. But I'd never really thought about our students as a consumer. So this might be a localized niche thing. But once I did, it really started to open my eyes to the way we were positioning our educational and training content to those students, because we weren't basing that on the rich experiences that we know that they have with the rest of the world. If you have any thought that your students don't have iPhones and they don't have the internet and they don't have Apple Watches and Dysons at home, maybe they don't have Dysons, and maybe they don't have all the bells and whistles, but they're exposed to this, right? And this starts to create a level of expectation for what their experiences are going to be like. And of course, we don't have the type of budget that Apple does. And of course, we don't have the type of budget that Dyson does. But we do know one thing, and that's that bad design is more expensive than good design, or at least it is in the consumer world, because all it takes is one bad experience for someone to say, I'm out, we're not doing this. But it's not just about aesthetics. That Dyson is not the prettiest thing you've ever seen, right? I mean, the watches, the mirrors, those websites are gorgeous, but it's not about the aesthetics entirely. It's about the way that they have structured experiences. And they've done that by focusing directly on user-centered design. They have included users in every step. And it started to create this realization that, are we including the right users? How are we including our users? And how could we start to meet expectations, even if not through big budget things, but by having experiences that make sense to the user, that add value? And how does that enhance learning? So we know a few things about our consumers. First, that they expect companies, as well as us, to understand their needs and their expectations. They expect us to be really tech savvy. They expect us to use existing technology in new ways. They want things to be responsive. They want it to not no longer be a nice to have, but responsiveness actually rank higher than knowledge and negotiation skills. And that's crazy when we think about that from the educational perspective. We also know that they want it to be personalized and relevant, and that we have information available to us. We have the Google machine, we have the internet. There's no reason anymore for us to have to store all of this information ourselves as humans, because it is always available to us, or at least pretty much always available to us. What we're evolving towards is having to understand how to curate the information that's available to us, how to siphon it into, how to make meaning out of it, and how to apply it. But we will get back to that. So
Alicia,
in preparation.
I hate to interrupt for 1 second, but I think we're not seeing your slides. As
Oh,
you're talking.
no. Oh, my goodness. I believe you are correct. I believe you are not. My goodness, I am going to fix that.
I didn't even feel they were necessary. I was, you were so descriptive, but then I realized I think you actually meant to show them by this point. So yes.
Yes, no, I triggered the slide on, and let me see if I can get it to do it. This one, technology is hard. It's not really a meeting until someone's on mute. Someone says, I can't see your slides. So we're now official. All right.
I've started screen sharing, and there we go. Excellent.
Okay, let me reverse, because I have to do that. My display settings. Okay, so let's see. What did you guys miss? You guys missed these beautiful examples. You missed my dumpster fire of what my current challenges are, the Dyson, the mirror, the phones, the beautiful examples of websites, the expectations of consumers, some of the consumer expectation statistics. And now we have arrived current with where I am. I apologize, guys. So in preparation for this talk, and as an evolution of this reframing of how I contextualized how we position learning, I decided to do just a really quick random search on learning science. And what I came up with was a lot of words that, of course, I was familiar with because I had been a learning scientist and had participated and read and researched and reviewed the research for decades, right? But when I really looked at this list and thought about, what do I do with this? I found myself a little bit at a disadvantage. I found myself struggling almost immediately. And so I did a deeper search. And what did I find? I found all of these practices, all of these little things that we should be including in our courses: spaced repetition, motivation, experiences, practice, assimilation, transfer, chunking, dual coding. And I realized that if we were to take all of this and all of the body of learning science and try to cram those into one course, that we would have provided an incredibly bad experience for our users. We can't have everything in one, but also we don't have a huge amount of direction unless we want to truly become incredibly efficacious learning scientists on what should be included, when, and how. And so I realized, there might be something here that perhaps we're not giving people what they need to successfully apply learning science. Now, not everybody is trying to apply learning science, but I think we would agree that historically there are a lot of lessons that have been learned that are important for us to learn. But in practice, how are we getting there? And so all of this got me thinking about one of my favorite pet topics. And if you guys have seen me present before, you know that one of my pet topics is memory. And that I strongly feel when it comes to learning, that if you don't remember something, you haven't learned it. Now, that's not to say that there's not voluminous amounts of unconscious learning that goes on with every interaction we have with the world today, but that there is an element of you have to have learned something. You have to remember it to learn it. And then there's all of this wild stuff that goes along with memory, because it is a pet topic of mine. It's harder to forget something than it is to remember it. Think about that one for a moment. And of course, we can think about why. Like, why is it harder to forget something? And it's because if we keep thinking of it or trying to forget it, we're creating that cognitive effect where we're recalling it, we're bringing it back into the forefront of our memory, and now we can't forget it. It's not like I can't unsee that. That's a little bit different, but it is something that we struggle through. So if we realize that everything has to be memorable for people to internalize it, how do we really start to organize that? And so we don't have to be told to learn. We learn every moment, but some of that information is just banging around in our heads, doing its own thing sometimes. And what we found, especially with the use of games and simulations, is that providing experiences helps people organize their knowledge into a meaningful construct. So that, okay, I can wrap my head around that, right? I can understand that we want people to have deep ingrained knowledge structures that are based on experience so that when they recall them, they have these experiences that they can draw upon. It's really the difference between an expert and a novice. It's experience. So, but we also know that memory is super fragile. It's super malleable, and that in a lot of ways, it makes us who we are. And it makes us who we are, which is different from who you are, and the Oprah of all the who you are, and you're getting a car and all of those things. So we know that memory is a super important part of us, but we do know that it is not exactly the most reliable source. And so I want to play a little check yourself exercise with you guys. So I'm going to give you guys just a moment to think of this. But the question is, where and when were you when you saw the first news footage? So seeing it on TV, essentially, of the first plane hitting the first tower on 9/11. So now this precludes anyone who happened to see it live, which, since this conference is based out in New York, I did this once at Columbia in New York, and it still went fine, honestly. But where and when were you when you saw the first plane hitting the first tower on 9/11? Forgive me, my international friends, you guys probably don't have the very visceral memories that we do over here of this event, but think about it. And now think about what you were doing, who you were with, where were you, and most importantly, when were you? Okay, so I have someone saying in my apartment in Vancouver watching the news. Certainly. When? I was in Japan at my friend's apartment in the evening, in my office, Austria, just after the call of my wife. In the chat, if you guys could tell me about how long after you first heard the news that planes were hitting towers in New York City, did you see the first news footage of the first plane hitting the first tower? I will not keep you guys in suspense for much longer. I'll tell you how it was for me. I called in sick to work that day, frowned upon when you work for the Department of Defense on a major terrorist act. I did have a doctor's appointment. I was truly sick, thank goodness, because that paperwork was requested. But I was in my apartment, certainly, and it was on the news, and the Pentagon bombing had happened and all of those things. And I remember seeing the second plane hit the tower because we all saw that. But I do have a memory of a short time later seeing a news recap of the first plane hitting the tower. I think a lot of us share this memory. It's a false memory, unfortunately. There was actually no news footage released of the first plane hitting the first tower until 9/12. So it was, they say, between 24 to 48 hours before that news footage was actually released, because no one was staring up at the building unless, like I said, you were there live. Horrific, awful events. Getting it on the news required getting together all of those road camera footage of people who happened to be there, getting the cameras from the other buildings that were still standing, compiling that, and then getting it on the news. So there's Malcolm Gladwell does a huge series on some really cool, not a huge series, but a really cool series on false memories. And 9/11 is one of his pet topics. And so I borrow this from him to remind us of how fragile things are. So why is that memory so fragile? Just as David mentioned in his introduction, we want people to make emotional connections with our content. We want to design for the future. We want to respect individuality. But when things that are truly impactful happen and we recall them over and over, we start to assimilate that information with the parameters of our recall. We start to contort our memories, if you will. So if anyone is mad at their significant other for something that you swear you remember, maybe cut them a break. Definitely don't get mad at them if you've had a dream that they've done something bad. I think we all do that. But think about how those things have actually happened and take a look at the research for yourself and see, where and when these things have occurred, because memory is a very, very wild thing. So moving forward, though, When I looked at all of this learning theory to think about how I should reframe my perspective from games and solely having those experiences to organize that knowledge, but then moving on to how I think about innovation and how we present learning, I reviewed all of these learning theories. And the one that stuck out to me was andragogy. And I will continuously pronounce it wrong in 7 different ways. Andragogy, I believe. Andragogy, pedagogy, andragogy, I believe. So andragogy was the one that stuck out. And it's partially because Knowles made it funny in 1984, and he titled a paper, An Adult Learner, a Neglected Species. And ain't that the truth, right? But pedagogy is technically the understanding of education of children. Andragogy is adults. And so he Knowles did these 6 principles that really resonated with me. And in 1984, long time ago, right? That's almost 30 years ago, if you can believe it. But number 1, we need to know why learning something is important to us. We have our own concept of self, and we don't like it when other people impose their will on us. We have a lot of existing knowledge, and we want that knowledge to be recognized. We open up when we think that the learning is going to help us with our problems, and not just help us with our problems, but help us with our problems immediately. And of course, we learn when we are internally motivated to do so. So through this lens, I started thinking about, okay, so the other tenets of learning science, all of these different elements that could have been in place, all of the chunking and the spacing and the repetition, how do we start to use that to conjure up the right kind of learning experience for our students, knowing about all of their consumer expectations, right? At this point, I'm ready to quit because this is tough stuff. So let's take a look at example. Do you know how to sexually harass somebody? And you see this example here. I think we've all been subjected to mandatory sexual harassment training annually, at least once, twice, 10, 100 times in our lives. So how do we prepare our students to truly ingest what it is that we're trying to teach them? And I think that often, at least the sexual harassment training that I have to take, has missed a few things. How would I know how to sexually harass someone as an artifact of how do I know if I'm being sexually harassed? Certainly opens up to a lot more design consideration and a lot more of the gray area, which might be what we're trying to get at. But imagine the image that I'm showing you here, and imagine this poor, frightened looking woman like leans up to this gentleman's ear and whispers, "The Sexual Harassment Act of 1984 prohibits this." You think that's going to help? No, but what are you assessed on when you take these classes? The year that it was, right? No one's ever stopped attacking me. Not that anyone's ever attacked me, because I knew the legislature, the policy. And these are the sorts of things that we typically see in our courseware. A lot of cliche, a lot of straight down the rabbit hole. That is so obvious. We miss the opportunity to actually think about what it is that we want people to take away from this. And I don't think anyone understanding the year that the policy was enacted, aside from it being historically, contextually super interesting, why did it take so long? I actually don't know if it was 1984, by the way. That's probably just rollover from the Knowles credit. But, what are we really trying to get someone to get out of this? And so I like to think about things from the opposite perspective. How would you know if you're being sexually harassed? How would you know if you were sexually harassing someone? How do you determine what that gray area is? How do you know how far you could go without crossing the line? At what point does it become illegal? I feel like if I knew that, I would have a much better ability to diagnose it when it was happening to me. But all joking aside, there's some things there. So when we think about how we include a user and taking a user-centered design focus in what is traditionally our instructional design, these are the elements that I feel like we could pull the thread further on. And these are the parts that get us to the emotional connection that doesn't go overboard, but provides a great user experience. So let's talk about instructional design. And I've reviewed the entire conference schedule. There are so many great talks that I want to go to. I saw a couple specifically about Agile when it comes to designing, implementing, delivering courses. And I was super excited about that. because I think if we've learned anything, it's that we can't continue to chase waterfalls or the waterfall methodology in our development and design of educational or training content, because it doesn't allow us to have the thing that makes things good, to my perspective, which is the user in the middle of this, the user centered in the design process. What we traditionally see is that instructional design involves subject matter experts, and they decide what a student should know, they decide how they should learn it, they decide what components should be present. But we also know from 1984, gosh, that's a theme. I didn't realize how many references I had to that year. That must have been a really big year in instructional design. That SMEs can only reach 30% of what students really need to know in order to be applying, in order to be applicable. And we also know that SMEs have a really distinct desire to teach the same way they were taught. And Dick Clark from University of California, amazing force in research, had this really interesting process of how you can unpack knowledge from SMEs in a way that makes it more consumable by courses. But what we tend to miss is that we've brought our SMEs in because they have something that we don't. They have this incredibly rich experience. They've done this if they're a great SME, right? They've done this for a long time. And it's those parts that we should be wanting to share with the students, not the components that we typically enlist them in, which is deciding what they should learn, how they should learn it, in deciding, that they're going to present this content, whether live or, online, determining what goes into the course, instead of sharing and being the storytellers that we believe that they could be, and that we think could really help advance learning by sharing those experiences. Just like games and simulations, storytelling, I think, is an incredibly strong way to let people have experiences, maybe not through their direct lens, but the experiences with others certainly can become part of our cognitive framework that allows us to assimilate information and process it in a way that makes sense. So waterfall just isn't, for me, anymore the best way. It's too long. It's too long before you get to a pilot and you get to find some feedback. It's too long that we have continued to prepare big pieces of content that don't take into account what a student might already know. And how do we know what they already know? We ask them, right? We include that user. So user-centered design, of course, is inherently agile because users are involved in the process from the very beginning. And there is the importance of requirement clarification. And as a girl who works for a DoD university that has a very heavy emphasis in requirements, that is something that I believe it's the hardest for us to clarify. Of course, user-centered design, let me give you a caveat, in this context is about product development, about developing something for a consumer. But if we start to put this lens on us and we start to think about involving users from the very beginning, and we start to clarify those requirements and introducing them into this iterative design process, we can actually speed up without very little slowdown. Sometimes you have to slow down to speed up. And Agile gives us an opportunity. I would be remiss now if I didn't mention Meg Torrance's llama process, which is a lot like Agile methodology for instructional design. Really great stuff in there. But even after having read that, I didn't make the connections till I really thought about this new frame of what is important and thought about the andragogical perspectives and thought about how we could really start to infuse this. So let me expand on this, if you don't mind. So we know that things have to be important to them and they should be internally motivated, but how much do we know about who our learners are? And a typical methodology in user-centered design is to create a user persona. And I'm showing you an example of one here. And it includes, there's lots of really cool software that will help you create these beautiful user personas. It includes some things that are relevant to what the product that is currently being developed is. You've got some personality, some preferences, some motivations, a little bio, some goals. What if we could create these for our students? I don't think it would ever be just one. I think we would have to include a couple of different types of students because we do have a broader area to cover. But what if we started creating user personas for our students? And what if we started thinking about who they are, how they arrived here, and how we get them to where we want them to be by including them, by learning about them, by having them within our systems. And so when I think about who we should include, I go straight Ebenezer Scrooge, right? I go the ghost of Christmas, past, present, and future. And so for me, the right composition is always going to be past, present, and future students. You want the ones who have taken it recently or a long time ago. You want the ones who are actually taking it, and you want the future students. You want to know how these people differ, how the experience that you've given them with the asset, course, design, implementation that you've made has truly impacted them, and to include them in order to get a much stronger sense of where they were coming in, where they are now, where they're going. And this is often the harder part. I didn't choose ghosts by example because you're going to feel like you might have to kill a few people and sacrifice some things in order to get these students in the room. But typically what I have found in our experience, and I hope that you find the same, is that when you tell students, past, present, and future, hey, we want to make things better by hearing from you, you'll get more volunteers and you know what to do with. They want to help. They want things to be better. They want their experiences to be pleasing. And a lot of times they're willing to invest their time and their thoughts into helping others because as humans, that's what we do. So get those Scrooge people. And when do we get them involved? So we have our past, present, and future. What is the right time? We know from the andragogical perspective that students want to know that the instruction is going to help them solve real world problems immediately. And that is the same time you should get them involved immediately from day one. So I want to give you guys another exercise. I'm just keeping a little bit track of my time. Great, we are doing fantastic. Let's take a look at a traditional learning objective. And I'm sure it's one that is a little bit trite, but I wanted to have something that we could all sort of sink our teeth into. And it's one that isn't that unrealistic, as Carla, my colleague, can tell us. My learning objectives is I want you to understand how the user's manual is organized. And so now check yourself. Think for just a minute about what you would design if this was the learning objective that you were given and you had to create an asset based on this. And when I say asset, I do mean live instruction, virtual instruction, synchronous, asynchronous, blended, video, built, mobile, whatever you want. What would be your initial thought of how will I get my users to understand how this user's manual is organized? Take just a second to do that. I'm going to have a sip of water. Okay, so because we can't communicate freely, I'm going to tell you what I would design. If you ask me, how are you going to get your students to understand how the user's manual is organized? I immediately think, well, it's just a user's manual. And I'm thinking not a huge one. I'm thinking a smaller one, of course. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a cool little online module that helps them understand how to navigate it, that introduces them to all the topics, that allows them to flip through it. And hey, maybe it has a search functionality. And you would, yeah, well, thank you, Carla. Carlos, that's my punchline, Carla. You know, that you could use yourself and that you could have as a reference on the job, right? So I've created a cool learning asset and a online tool that they can actually use. But what if you included your users and you asked them, what do you guys use this user's manual for? What kind of problems do you guys have to refer to the user's manual for? How often do you use this manual? Do you use the user's manual at all? What kinds of things make sense within the user's manual? Is there anything about the user's manual you would change? What if I went through the Learner Center activity and I found out that they do in fact use the user's manual and that I asked them that important question that Carla coined. And so I will give her full credit for that so that they can, so that you can do what? So if I thought, understand how the user's manual is organized so that I can question mark and ask the learners to pull it in, ultimately what I would come up with potentially in this use case, yes, would be, I need to understand how the user's manual is organized so that I can answer customers' questions quickly and knowledgeably. Okay, great. That is fantastic. That's a so that I can. That's a performance focused objective. Makes total sense. But now I want you to revisit what it is that you thought you would build. And again, for me, it was I'm going to create a searchable online asset that they can use on the job that explains how it's navigated and how they navigate it and how everything's organized. Now let's look at the new objective so that I can quickly answer questions knowledgeably. Oh no, I'm designing something completely different now, right? You want me to be able to answer customers' questions quickly and knowledgeably? Oh boy. So what I really need to design in this case is something that includes questions from the customers that helps me, there's a speed element. I need to go and figure out how quickly can I find things in the user's manual. I need to know how it's organized so that I can really delve into it. I need to understand everything that's in it, not just how it's organized. I need to be the owner of this, or at least be able to understand how to interpret it. I have to know where the FAQs are. I need to be able to tell my customer where they can find this in the user's manual if they have it again. I'm designing a completely different course now than I would have if I was given the traditional learning objective. And I think that that's where some of the importance of this construct comes in. If we ask the user what that learning objective might mean to them, they might have said, no, we don't use the user's manual for everything, in which case I'm not investing a lot of time and money into this asset because they're not actually using it. But if they had given me this so that I can, I would have designed an experience that met a different need. And a lot of times when we are presented with learning objectives in isolation without the user, that's what can happen. We can design for the wrong thing. And when we're in waterfall, we can design for the long thing for a long time before we realize that what the user really needed to know and wanted to know and would increase the feelings of relevance, and it would reduce the level of patronization that they might feel when we present them with stuff that they don't need. We could have really changed that user's perspective. And that's incredibly important when we think about what we ultimately want our students to be as consumers of knowledge and education. We want our students to be lifelong learners. We want them to come back to us, certainly, especially if they're paying for our content and our courses, but we want them to understand that there are good learning experiences out there, that they don't have to lower their expectations every time they see that it's time to take their, sexual harassment training. If that girl had whispered into that man's ear, the Sexual Harassment Act of 1984 says you can't do this, I would have stood up and applauded my sexual harassment training because at least they had a sense of what I might find engaging because I think it's fun. So another andragogical perspective, the concept of self and recognizing prior learning. We know that our users want this. They don't want us to disregard it. We didn't show up here like newborns. We didn't come out of the womb. We do new stuff. And UCD, user-centered design, has this great process that they call a customer journey map. Again, the elements of user-centered design that I'm showing you are specifically typically for product development. But when we look at this through the lens of learning, I see another opportunity here. I see an opportunity to chart a learner's pathway from where they are now, but also back to where they've been, and to build on what we know that they know. We're just starting to implement some adaptivity, test out, and the ability to have some choices in how you receive content at my particular university. That's going to be huge for the user experience because a lot of our stuff is policy. It also gives us a new opportunity to think about the level to which we design our courses. So when we think about the learning objective that we just played around with, the understanding the user's manual, if that was an element of 10 different jobs and I created a micro asset that just covered that, I could understand where a customer, who is our student, don't forget, was going, where they'd been. Maybe they hadn't been exposed to the training manual. I can give that in isolation. I can make that part of their entire customer journey map. I can allow them to show proficiency in it if they know the user's manual already and say they don't have to repeat this. I can use it as reinforcement. If I can drive down to the right levels and I have a clear customer journey map that tells me exactly what is happening, I can also start to derive where the pain points are. And I think that what we find is that the pain points often come from things like spending way too much time doing this or that, being drugged backwards to stuff that we already know. In that sexual harassment training, like, I get it, I can do it, right? I don't need to do this necessarily every single year. Next year, let me test out, and don't make my test out solely about the policy. Make it experiential. Give me an intelligent assessment that allows me to show that I understand this. And that's not easy to do. But when you have the right people, and those right people are often the users in the room, you would be shocked at what is possible. So now let's take a look at activity, because one of the things that David, and I know many of you are speaking about at this conference as well, David mentioned, are the ability to use all of these rich analytics in our courses, right? It's a whole new world. And I think that it's easy to imagine that this behavior level feedback, which is what I think about when I get analytics from my students, when I instrument via XAPI, via some other tracking capability, I start to think, well, I'm hearing my user there, right? So maybe I don't need the user in the design loop. Maybe I could not think about bringing them in to look at a course that exists, because I'm going to instrument it and I should get all the data that I need. But let's take a look at how this can also betray us, much like our memories. So what does it mean if a majority of your students get the same question wrong during assessment? You've had this course out there forever, and this is the question that is performing the least favorably. It's the one that everybody's getting wrong, and you know something has to happen. So you might do an analysis, and you would only know this if you had some analytics on your courseware. And so again, you might think, oh, I get it. The students are getting this wrong because either the question is wrong, like, oops, that happens. We've seen that, right? The content that we have put there doesn't cover that question. But what if it's because it's irrelevant? What if it's because this isn't realistic to what a student does? What if it's because they've never heard of it, despite the fact that they've been on the job for 10 years? How would we understand that? We might just keep rewriting this question. So now conversely, what does it mean? What does it tell us if a majority of students get the same question right during assessment? So you've got the one that nobody gets right. Then you've got the one that everybody gets right every time. What does that tell us? That could tell us a couple of things too: that the question is wrong, that the content is sufficient, or that it's irrelevant. And so I want you guys to think about that. If we had the same perspective on polar opposites of the scale, they're getting it right every time, they're getting it wrong every time, the answer may still be that it's irrelevant, either because they don't use this, they already knew it, which meant, why are you assessing me on it again? Why does it still exist in this course if this is core knowledge that everybody who does this has? Why is this being presented to us? These are the starts of things that chip away and don't meet user expectations, and that we don't know until we start to include them. So I wanted to just include something that gives a caveat, because we think about all of that rich data as being connected to our students, but sometimes it's not the connection that we need. Back to Scrooge, past, present, future students, every time. So how often do we get them involved? It's like, how often does your heart beat, right? Every step of the way. Quality is perceptual, and that's really hard. We talked about quality not necessarily being related to visual every time, but certainly perceptual. How someone feels that they are being respected as an individual, how someone feels that they are being challenged, how someone feels that you have made it obvious how they're going to use it. It's a feeling, it's perceptual, it's more than a checklist, but ultimately there has to be some parameters, and deciding those should be based, we're just going to keep saying it, with the users, right? Get those users in there, let them tell you what quality is. There's lots of great methodologies for this, and we're going to cover some of the UCD methodologies. But first, I wanted to do, I believe, one more exercise with you. What if I were to present a new ontology for numbers to you? So take a look at this 1 through 9. Try not to write it down. Don't screen cap it, because there is going to be a quiz. But I'm going to give you guys 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That long. Okay, could you write out 5389 using that ontology? Hit me with a yes or a no in the chat if you have for it. Like, how many of you remember exactly what 5389 were? Yeah, no, right? Yeah. So I show you this example not because I feel like this is an incredibly great example of learning, but it is a great example for me as someone who has to start to recognize that I'm not the subject matter expert on everything. And sometimes that's hard for us to think of, right? We get so close to our content, we get so close to our curriculum, we get so close to the work that actually does emotionally mean something to us. And when we see something new, we are reminded that, oh my gosh, that's why a subject matter expert is here. So someone busted this out on me the other day and I was like, so here is the solution, 5389. I've asked you to remember this and to write out this number. So what if instead I had showed you this? So Carla made it complicated. But if I showed you this, would you, do you get it now? And tell me if you don't, because yes, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, how many of these things exist in the content world that I have been mucking around in for a decade that I didn't know existed? It was just such a bang that, wow, that is a pretty cool trick that makes the picture very clear that a well-designed experience could be done in a different way. And so I wanted to share this with you, use it. I had to recreate it, of course, it's a pain, but because it just demonstrates that maybe there are elements that we're not even able to consider that our students would know some great trick for. I hear about students who took like the new math. I took the old math. Actually, there's a girl here who went to high school and junior high, and I think elementary school, Kelly with me, and she took the old math with me, right? But you hear these students that took the new math and like, they don't even do things the same way. And I'm like, I don't even get it. And someone busted one of those out on me in an earned value management course. They're like, well, why don't you explain it like this? And I was like, ew. So as much as we have this learning science, it's so important to have the diversity of thought in the room, to have others that have just wildly different perspectives than you, because my perspective is never going to be a huge equalizer. Okay, so what are some of the really cool activities? I just want to cover these really quickly with you guys because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. So my favorite user-centered design activities is Mad Libs. And you guys remember Mad Libs, right? It would be a sentence and then there would be spaces and you had to fill in the spaces. I actually had an instructor, abnormal psychology in college, who did this. He would give us a printout of the slides, but he would cut out words from the slides and just leave a blank. And you would just, he'd have the slide up and you would write the word in. I love that approach because it wasn't me feverishly trying to write down every word. It was some keywords that I would then include and then have this as a wonderful piece of reference. But in user-centered design, it's not atypical to find out what people feel or how they see the world by having, some keywords missing. Like, I think this product is, that's such a lame example. I don't have a better one, but imagine, look it up, super cool stuff there. Wizard of Oz testing, another one of my favorites. And the construct is that you are making things happen from behind the screen. You're the all-powerful Oz. And as someone, who used to be game czar and thereby used to be royalty, in my head, at least, I think that that is such a cool prospect when we think about how we can make system testing possible when we haven't fully designed a system, right? We have to use some theatrics. We've got to pull some strings in the back and see how users would react and use it. 5-second testing. Show someone for something for 5 seconds. I gave you guys 10 on the other one to see if it's long enough, see if they need more time, get a sense of what you're going to be spending on time, via time with objects. A/B testing. It's simple. Here's version 1. Here's version 2. Which do you like better? Which one meets your needs? Out of the box. This one is super cool, not so relevant to us, but when you get a new product, actually, I have a cool example right here. I got this skincare, and when I open the box, there's messages on the inside of each little square. I love that. I spent a lot of money on that stuff. And it made me incredibly feel much better about the amount of money I spent on something. And, I want to iterate because I think that that's an important point that just came up in my head. When we think about our learners, when we think about the experiences that we want them to have, if we don't give the content the importance of being well-designed, hyper-relevant, focused on what they need to do, then we are immediately cheapening their ability to learn it. If I see something that just looks terrible, like superficially looks terrible, it wasn't that important, huh? Like if you really wanted me to learn it, if this is so important, you would have invested in this, right? And so out of the box is when you send people things and you have them open the box and see if they can put it together, if they can get it started, what their experience out of the box is. And I think that that's often what our very first gut reaction for all of our courseware is. If I'd seen that picture of a sexual harassment, I would immediately out of the box thought, no, this is gonna be terrible. Think aloud, just like I clearly do, just talking it aloud. What would I do? Okay, so I guess I put this over here. A lot of information you can get from students on that. Observing, of course, focus groups and interviews. We all know how to do those, so I won't lament on those, but those are some of the really cool activities. I think when it comes to user-centered design, there is almost more finesse as a science, which I do think it is. It's more of an application. It's a process through which we can start to funnel and filter the lessons that we've learned from learning science. That's sort of how I see user-centered design. But I think that a majority of the finesse isn't necessarily in creating these interesting ways to extract information from users, but then what do you do with this information? There's so much information you can glean from these, and you have to really create trends. You have to understand majority principles. You've got to set up a curve because you can't make every single person happy. But if you can make more people happy than sad, and it's a pleasant user experience, then the learning is going to be enhanced. So here's some really bad examples of user-centered design. I mean, what button do you push? Like, how is the zero? No. 88% of online shoppers say they wouldn't return to a website after having a bad user experience. I think that all of us feel the same in our consumer lives. Like this star and the 5, like, is that 5 stars? Or is that 5 people gave it 1 star? It doesn't make any sense, right? Humans have affordances and we have to respect those. The pull and the push, how many times have we done that? And this store is the most confusing one I've ever seen. Like, do I pull that? Do I push it? If it's flat, you push. If it's got handles, you pull, right? People mess it up all the time. I used to live in an apartment and it had not the nicest place. It had a sink, of course. It was that nice, right? But it had the sink disposal. And the button for the sink disposal, if the sink was here, the button was flush up against the counter facing outward on the sink. So if I leaned into it, the disposal would start. If I touched it at all, disposal's on. Terrifying. Who thought this was a good idea? But people do. We see it all the time. Go to Fail Army. But as a closing thought to where we get to the scene, I think that one of the things it's really easy to get caught up in, though, is that importance in user-centered design of determining your requirements. And when we think about requirements for objectives and how those evolve, I think that it's really important that we continue to see through our users the evolution. And I think that this image does just a really nice job of showing it. Yes, initially we wanted something that could get us from point A to B. But then we realized, well, it'd be nice if it had a handle that I could like put something on. And then, oh, well, maybe I could do it faster. And it'd be nice if I didn't have to continue to pedal. Ooh, it'd be nice if I could get there really fast. And hey, you know what? I'm tired of being outside. I want to be in the car. And that is an evolution that is necessary for us to remain ahead of our consumer students, right? We can't have status quo. Putting the wheels on it and getting them there is the first step. But as the users become more adept at systems, as they become more advanced, we're able to increase this trajectory. And if we could apply that to learning, if we could get people from a skateboard to a car in the knowledge that they gain, think of what we could do with our own courseware. We'd have a whole lot smarter people working on them too. And so we could bring those into our discipline and leverage those thoughts. So I think that the potential is endless. But for me, it really does come down to the importance of this stitch, right? This theme, this place that lives between these two worlds, and how those potentially have an amazing impact on learning. And that is how I sort of arrived here. And so that's my story. I hope that it inspires, that's a big word. I hope that it at least gives you an opportunity to think through things a little bit differently. And I hope that you guys have enjoyed this as much as I have. And so at this point, David, I would love to open it up for questions if anyone has any in the chat, or I don't know if people can come off mute. I don't know what it is. David, I'll leave it to you to tell me.
Fantastic. Well, we do have a couple of questions already that have accumulated in the chat and the Q&A. So we have one from earlier about the role of the user. So how do you mentioned the users being part of, sort of involved very heavily in design, involved in the design process. What about situations in which, this is the question from one of our audiences, Trevor, what about situations in which the users don't really know what they need? And how do you handle that?
That's such a great question. And, I think sometimes we forget, what if this is truly is a novice user? They don't know what they don't know. How could you pull someone what they don't know? And I think that even when that's the case, like when I think about using at least the past and the present as opposed to the future. So let's think of the one that you're evoking here as the future student, right? So they don't know what they don't know. When I think about the past and the present students, I think about some of the constructs that we saw from learning science, like feedback. And I think I used this example with Kinga in her podcast last week. We know that it's really important to provide students with meaningful and timely feedback. And we know what our content is. We know what we ask them. But how do we know what is meaningful to them? How do we know what is timely for them? Those are the sorts of things that I love for past and present students. When it comes to future things, I think that that's most important for them to get involved early in the design phase. And when I think about an agile methodology and designing things in really small chunks and having things like future students in that loop, I think about, okay, what are your reactions to this? Did you learn it? Do we need to tweak anything here? How does this make you feel? Does this feel important to you? Do you feel like we've respected you? And so I think there's a place for all three of those groups.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you there. And just one probably thing maybe worth noting, your example of sort of progressing from the skateboard to the car. Like, if all you have is a skateboard and you think nothing else can ever happen, you might not, you won't necessarily say, hey, what I really need is a car. But if you run the idea of a car by somebody and you've understood the audience, you've understood their goals, and you've understood what they might need, you're getting good feedback there about, like, is this something that you're going to want? You're not necessarily asking them to design what they want. You're asking them for, comments and vetting and feedback on where you're going. I think that's kind of in line with, you mentioned Apple as well, right? Like the first iPod or the first iPhone, it wasn't clear that people, I'm not surprised that people wanted them, but I don't think there was, like, Steve Jobs was not doing focus groups, and he's been very clear that he didn't do that, right? Doing focus groups and saying, what do you want? But it was rather come up with ideas and run them by the audience. I think that's probably the distinction. Next question from the Q&A was a little bit different. You've talked about learners as being customers. And the question here is, do you think they're more, I guess following on this, should they really be considered partners as the term rather than customers? That's a question from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, no, 100%. As much as you can partner with someone who you have the obligation of providing a service to, right? But as much, I think it is a partner relationship through the development design. Those Scrooges, the ghosts, the past, present, future, those are your partners in this design process. And give them credit for it, right? Thank you. Throw credit at the end of your course. We never put credits at the end of their courses. Make sure that being part of your process and partnering with you to make a better course for tomorrow for future students is something that is important to them and that they want to do too, in recognition of who they are as adult learners. One of the learning theories, and you're gonna kill me, I can't remember which one, was the teach something, do something, or do something and then teach it to someone else, and that was a really good way of deepening your learning and increasing your depth and breadth of knowledge. And I think that we all believe that's true, because you have to really get to know the inside of something. But, as you start to include students in your design and you begin to see what can sometimes become the usual customers, the usual partner, if you will, as these things evolve, it's important to realize that they're getting something amazing out of this too. And they see that. they know that they are deepening their own knowledge and going to be better for it on the other side.
Thanks. Okay, we have another question as well. This comes from Simon. What's your experience of the barriers posed by curriculum? Meaning that it says one problem that they have is that they have to set their curriculum a few years in advance, and then it's difficult to change. And so that undermines the ability to be flexible and user-centered as fully as they would like. So how could, I guess the question is, yeah, what's your experience with that? And maybe are there things that we can do to try to head that off while still adhering to the requirements that come from the outside?
I think it's all about putting your best feet forward in some cases. Obviously, you guys can't all go home and tear your curriculums apart and say, well, we've got to get the users in there. Starting with a couple of your most frequently used courses. And I hear you that you have a cycle of design that means that it's designed a couple years in advance. But, making the business proposition, when we think about education as a business, that a bad experience is more expensive than a good one, making sure that you can evaluate the need to go back and actually revisit some of the topics, and just starting with little sections and replacing them as you go, and having people start to, it's the tipping point, if you will, for these sorts of things. Like, wow, module 1 was great. Module 7 is still old and it's a hot mess. And when people start complaining, people start listening, unfortunately. But because so many of our users have those lowered expectations, they're not complaining. They see those awful graphics and like, oh yeah, well, this is what I expected. So we got to raise all of those bars at the same time.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a different question, and maybe we can take some more from the audience if they come in as well. You talked a little bit before about being agile. You talked about sort of, I guess, really, getting things up quickly, essentially rapid prototyping. There's a feel in the sort of the software marketplace by trying to get the MVP out, the minimum viable product, right? And to get that out. What's your view of MVP sort of relative to rapid prototyping? You probably know where I'm going with this question, and you probably know my own views. But I'm interested to hear sort of your perspective on this one.
So my organization pushes MVP pretty hard. And I believe that if we were properly agile, that the MVPs, there would be multiple MVPs at the modular level or at the smaller asset level, and those would go through a review process and refinement. I think it is inappropriate to use an MVP for anything other than a pilot, because when we release MVPs into the wild, we have two choices. Number one, release something that isn't great and isn't the best user experience, but we did fast, and lower the expectations again, or provide someone with an experience that is awful and make them not want to return. But if we were to mark something MVP, if we were to put right up on there, hey, this is an MVP and we're going to start reworking this course immediately, and it's going to be beautiful, and that will be available next year, I'm not taking that course either, right? I'm like, I'll just wait a year unless it's mandatory, and then I'm going to be crabby about that also. So I don't think that there is a win-win in releasing an MVP. I think the beauty of MVPs is getting it out to the smaller groups and getting that feedback at the much smaller chunk level before you've invested the time and money in creating a huge course that nobody likes. We create little courses. Like, we want to fail fast. We want to find out quickly and then get in, get out.
Yeah, and I think my own personal thinking on some of the MVP stuff is the idea that there's, I think, a concern, at least I have a concern that can limit design, right? In other words, I think at the implementation level, getting something out quickly is the right thing. But if you constrain your design in order to be able to only think about things you can build quickly, you find yourselves, in a tunnel, and you find yourself building things that are minimal, that don't need to be minimal, and you don't put yourself in a position to really rethink it. So, I kind of tend to advocate thinking much more freely about the ideal solution and then scaling back from the solution. And then maybe you can only build what you can build. We all have budget constraints and time constraints and, trying to get things out and all that. And so there are a lot of things to balance, but there's something to be said for trying to keep the design in the early stages ideal in terms of your thinking before you scale it back. And that usually gets you in a different place in the end than dealing with constraints.
And there were exceptions, of course. In the pandemic, we had to go rogue. If you have, dynamic daily things like our soldiers in the field, daily briefs, like it doesn't matter what it looks like at that point. That information has to get out. But when we have the opportunity, we should do our best.
Right, absolutely. And yeah, and then certainly some cases are emergencies. You need to do, right. You need to do something. You can't, you certainly can't
boil the water.
anything. Yeah. So this must be done now. Yes. Great. Okay. Well, it is just about the end of the time that we have. So absolutely enjoyed every moment of this. It's wonderful to have you as our opening keynote, and I'm so glad you'll be around for the rest of the conference. And people can hopefully find you in the chat and in the Whova app and wherever else you may be over the rest of the parts of the week that you can make it. Thank you once again. I'm sure there's applause out there that we can't hear because that's the nature of these these virtual conferences, but it's absolutely wonderful. So thank you once again. It's great to have you here. And then we're coming up next. We're going to actually have see, there's applause already in the chat. All capital letters applause. You can't get better than that in a chat.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you so much. It's great to talk to you. We're going to take a break. We're off until 10:30 and then coming back in 3 streams. So check your Whova app, pick the stream you want to be there, and we'll see everybody back in 15 minutes. So thanks again.